Hello and welcome to Global Eye. The United States and China should be partners and not rivals. That's what Chinese President Xi Jinping told U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken during his visit to Beijing. Blinken arrived in China on the 24th of April in what was seen as a lukewarm welcome by the Chinese authorities. His trip to China, the second in 1 year, comes as the two nations seek to expand communication and stabilize rocky ties, while also navigating a host of thorny issues, particularly China's support for Russia, its aggression in the South China Sea and towards Taiwan. Xi Jinping told Blinken that there are still a number of issues that need to be resolved between China and the US. He said that the earth is big enough to hold the common development and prosperity of China as well as the United States. In a meeting with the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang, Blinken expressed Washington's concerns about the support that China provides to Russia. In fact, the US is threatening sanctions against Chinese companies for supporting the Russian defense industry. It is also considering tariffs to counter overcapacity of Chinese manufacturing. Responding to Blinken, Wang Yi said China's legitimate development rights have been unreasonably suppressed. He asked if the United States wants to keep moving forward with stability or return to a downward spiral. To discuss that and more, we are now joined by Brahma Chlani, strategic affairs expert. We will also later on the program joined by a senior Chinese expert, Mr. Einar Tangen. But let me first go across to Brahma Chlani. Mr. Chellaney, how do you see the conversation between US and China at this juncture? It definitely looks uncomfortable, and China seems to be warning the United States.
Blinken's Beijing trip is part of President Biden's diplomatic outreach to Beijing to help stabilize US-China relations. Biden and Xi Jinping held a summit meeting in San Francisco last November. And before that summit meeting, Biden sent 5 of his cabinet officials, one after another, to Beijing. And in more recent months, after the summit, there have been more high-level official visits from the US. We had the US Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, going to Beijing recently, and now it's Blinken in Beijing. The fact is that Biden, because of America's preoccupation with 2 wars, the war in Ukraine and also America's growing involvement in the conflict in the Middle East, America looks overextended. It doesn't want a 3rd war to erupt. If China were to attack Taiwan, that would result in America's direct involvement in a war with China. So to dissuade Xi Jinping from attacking Taiwan, Biden is relying more on diplomacy than on deterrence. The question is whether this diplomatic outreach, whether that will succeed in dissuading Beijing from committing aggression against Taiwan.
Mr. Chellaney, the US, and this is a message that Blinken is carrying, that they are considering sanctions on certain Chinese entities. And this is because, one, because of Chinese security threats in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, in the larger Indo-Pacific, also on the kind of pressures that American companies have been facing, also dumping of renewable energy components, electric vehicle components as well. So in case US goes ahead with these kind of sanctions, how do you expect China to respond?
Well, first, let's look at the larger picture. The Ukraine war has helped raise the specter of the United States realizing its worst geopolitical nightmare, a Sino-Russian strategic axis. A China-Russia alliance is the worst strategic nightmare for Washington. And yet, this war in Ukraine is bringing China and Russia closer together. Secretary of State Blinken said earlier this month, he called China the primary contributor to Russia's defense industrial base. The fact is that Xi Jinping is aiding Russia's war machine in an apparent effort to keep the US tied down in Europe in the Ukraine war and further deplete NATO arsenals before he decides to invade Taiwan. As for the threat of US sanctions against China, consider this. The US has imposed no meaningful sanctions against Beijing, despite China's Muslim Gulag in Xinjiang, which holds more than 1 million detainees, despite China's expansionism in the South China Sea, despite Xi Jinping snuffing out Hong Kong's autonomy, and despite China openly flouting US sanctions on Iran by becoming almost the exclusive buyer of Iranian oil. Now, if the Americans have not imposed sanctions against China for all these egregious actions, do you really expect the US to impose sanctions against Beijing for contributing to Russia's defense industrial base? It'll be a real surprise if the Americans were to impose any meaningful as opposed to symbolic sanctions against China. Yes.
Give us a sense of the Chinese priorities right now, Mr. Chellaney, especially vis-a-vis Taiwan. This is also one of the concerns in the region. Do you expect China to make any kind of direct actions towards Taiwan which may threaten the security of the region or US's posture or US interests in the region?
Well, there are two things to keep in mind. One, that Xi Jinping has been saying quite openly, and he in fact told Biden bluntly when they met at their summit meeting in San Francisco last November, that China will absorb Taiwan. The only issue that needs to be decided is when to act. Second, the question is whether China has the kind of capability to execute a successful military operation against Taiwan. There is a sea separating China from Taiwan, and carrying out an amphibious assault invasion of Taiwan requires tremendous superiority in all areas, including naval power, air power. And it's not very clear whether China has that capability. The last thing Xi Jinping wants is to launch an invasion of Taiwan and then meet with stiff Taiwanese resistance. That would be a huge defeat for Xi Jinping. He will lose power very rapidly in China. So before he decides to invade Taiwan, he would like to be sure that his military operation would be successful.
All right. Mr. Chellaney, thank you so much for giving us your perspective on the Blinken visit to China and the message that the Chinese leadership has given out to him. Let me now go across to Einar Tangen, joining us from Beijing. Mr. Tangen, thank you very much for joining us. Beijing has conveyed to the United States that you need to choose between stability and downward spiral. What's the larger message here and the consequences?
Well, the U.S. keeps saying that they want to have better communications, that they want to manage a contentious relationship. But, you know, when you're sending your number one diplomat over, it's not wise to be attacking Chinese companies like TikTok. It's not wise to be releasing human rights reports, which are basically echoing the kind of lies that were told by, I shouldn't say lies, the falsehoods were being told by Professor Chellaney, that there's 1 million Uyghurs being locked up in Xinjiang. I mean, these things are false. You can repeat. The issue is that you can say one lie, and it's easy to refute. But if you say 1,000 lies or 10,000 lies, or you say more lies every day, it's impossible. And this is what the U.S. is doing. They want to flip the script. They want to kind of take attention away from, you know, what's happening in Gaza. They want to talk about China as the evil empire, as they did about Japan back in the 70s. In 1986, they forced Japan to sign the Plaza Accords. Today, Japan's economy in real dollar terms is worth less than it was in 1986. The U.S. does not play well with rising powers. It didn't matter if this was China or if it was India. They would expect the same treatment. It has to do with America's belief that only America can be in charge of the world, that it's necessary, that white men need to be in control to make sure that other men do not create World War III, even if they start World War III.
Right. I'd also like to ask you, one of the big concerns and probably a trigger point for this visit to Beijing was China's support for Russia, which also Blinken raised and told a news conference that U.S. has serious concerns about China's provision of dual-use parts that are powering Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. Do you think the Chinese administration will give any concessions to the United States or walk the talk with U.S. when it comes to Russia?
Well, when it comes to Russia, I mean, China and Russia have a trade agreement that predates any kind of issues in Ukraine. The fact is that China is not exporting weapons. They've been deliberately not doing that. They weren't happy with what happened in Ukraine, but they understand that this was a situation that was precipitated by the United States. Whether you're talking to Kissinger, Kiernan, any United States statesman, before, they would have said categorically, uniformly, if you go into Ukraine, the Russians will fight you. Despite that, the U.S. deliberately went in, and now they've thrown Europe under the bus, which is suffering the economic consequences. The fact is that if Washington wasn't criticizing China, they would be criticizing India, since India is the largest purchaser of Russian oil, much of which is going to Europe. So this is just pure political politics. The United States sees threat from China because it's of economic rise, and they're doing everything they can to contain it. And, using disinformation when you have $90 billion a year that goes to the Department of Defense for that purpose, it's easy to do.
Right. One more question that I'd like to ask you about the recent Trilateral Summit that took place, which was clearly aimed at China. Do you think that has irked China and they see this as an interference in its neighborhood?
Yeah, of course. I mean, any kind of alliance that is aimed at you, whether it's AUKUS, the Quad, or expanding either one of them, whether it's selling very sophisticated arms to Taiwan, stationing troops who are U.S. troops there to train the Taiwanese. These are all things which are aimed directly at China. As I said, it's not that the U.S. wants a war, but they're trying to keep things on a low simmer, to, quote, manage China, to contain it, to, divert its attention away from its economic rise towards defense. And that has been partially successful. But this time, Blinken has come to China, very clear. Wang Yi said 3 no's. Stay out of Taiwan, stay out of the South China Seas in terms of interfering with China, and also stop weaponizing the economy. And then Xi Jinping said, look, we're open. We want to be partners, but you don't seem to want to be that way. So, there's this old adage, how many times can I slap you before you don't want to shake my hand? I mean, in classic terms, this is the prisoner's dilemma. That's when you have 2 prisoners who can cooperate and therefore both gain, or they can try to do each other in which case both of them will suffer more. So, at this time, China realizes that and says, look, we have to cooperate. On the Washington side, they're saying, we don't care, we're right. And no matter what you do, we're going to try to do you in, much like they did with the peace processes.
One more question before we wrap, and this is on the manufacturing powers and the manufacturing fight between US and China. Recently, we've seen sales of Tesla slowing down in China. BYD was the big gainer. They surpassed Tesla globally in 2023 sales. Apple sales have seen a downside, a degrowth in China as well. Today, we're seeing the Chinese Motor Show as well, where a lot of models have been showcased for the future. Do you feel that this is also a concern for the United States in some way, that the slow growth of its own products, of its own companies in China is not good. Somewhere they feel that there is a clampdown on these companies. There are incentives given by Chinese companies to their to the Chinese-run, state-run companies.
Well, that's not true. I mean, if you go back to 2018, there were over 115 EV companies. None of them were being subsidized. There's been brutal competition since then, and now you're down to just a few. The fact is that China is that these companies are able to deliver cars that are much better than the existing luxury cars for a third to a half of the price. And this is what is attracting consumers. No one is forcing anyone to buy a Chinese car, and they're not being subsidized. This is just one of those, one of a 10,000 lies that are being told every day and repeated. You know, it's right out of Hermann Goebbels and, you know, the Nazi propaganda thing. Tell a big lie and keep repeating it, and people will believe it. And this is exactly what the U.S. is doing.
Right, we've run out of time, but thank you very much, Mr. Tangen, for joining us with that perspective. US-China ties definitely tense, but both sides are saying that we need to manage these differences, and there needs to be a certain threshold beyond which the relationship must not deteriorate. To discuss more, we will be getting more guests and perspectives in the days to come. But for the moment, we are going to take a short break on Global Eye. When we return, we'll shift our focus to the Middle East. Israeli forces continue to pound the overcrowded city of Rafah as they prepare for a proposed ground invasion. A special discussion when we return.